Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished scholars of non-binary gender, welcome to another riveting, exciting meeting of the Philosophy Club here at California State University, Sacramento Stingers Up. I am Daniel, your club's treasurer. We have Dr. Marnie Binder here with us talking about her book, and to do the rest of the intro, I now turn the time over to club president William.
Hello, everyone, here and in the future. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, today is going to be a presentation slash just general conversation about a Pragmatist Philosophy of History by Dr. Marnie Binder, who is here with us as our special guest. And by way of like general sort of introduction to that kind of topic, it's not necessarily playing on, describing an entirely new field, but defining a new sort of approach to the philosophy of history, if I understand it correctly. So if I guess right, we'll be starting with sort of general conversation questions with regard to what the pragmatist philosophy of history is hoping to address, what kind of questions it's hoping to answer, provide frameworks for answering, and then proceed into more of a specific discussion about, or that pertains more particularly to the book. And with that, we can safely turn it over to Dr. Marnie Binder. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for having me so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to come talk to you about this, share my project. Pragmatism is not something that I ever get to talk about in any of the classes that I teach, and so I really jump at any opportunity to talk about it. And I could probably squeeze more of it into some of my classes, but generally I don't get to talk about this. So I appreciate that and the invitation. So yeah, basically this project arose out of my doctoral dissertation. So that turned into some articles, and then I put it together now as a book. I had a lot of material to work with. My dissertation was like exceedingly long. It was 600 pages. So yeah, but it was about pragmatism and philosophy of history, and I was looking at some Spanish philosophy as well. But this book that I've now put together has some new elements that I didn't explore in my dissertation. 3 brand new philosophers that I only more recently studied, and that's George Herbert Mead, although he's more so known as a social psychologist. And I've finally dived deeper into Charles Peirce. And also I've added in a chapter on Jane Addams, who's somebody that's very, very, I think, underappreciated, her contribution. So yeah, that's essentially where this came from, and where it's been different from what I initially was studying while I was doing my PhD. So yeah, I was thinking, as William said, for the format today, that maybe we could just start with like a general conversation of centered around some of the main questions that I try to address from a pragmatist perspective in this book. So they all, of course, have to do with philosophizing about history, which is this sub area that I've been very, very interested in for a long time, and one that I would say is quite obscure, not really all that popular here in the United States, but yeah. So the first question I wanted to address is just this general topic of the philosophy of something, like the philosophy of history. Is this a misnomer? This is my first question. This Spanish philosopher, Jose Ortega y Gasset, he thought it was a misnomer, and instead that when we speak of things like, say, metaphysics or philosophy of mind, because there's so many different sub-theories, sub-ideas within that maybe sometimes it's not accurate to sort of lump it all together. Sure, there's a set of shared concerns and questions that are being explored, but then the next question becomes, when is enough shared that we can kind of put them together into this category? So Ortega proposed, for example, instead of philosophy of history, he wanted to describe his work exploring these kinds of questions as a theory on and not of history, right? Because this is, of course, very different to say on, right, versus of philosophy. Maybe I think Ortega says this because of the fact that we cannot ever capture and record all of history, not to mention that time doesn't stop, of course. History keeps collecting. The present is fleeting. It becomes the past almost as quickly as we say it, right? So history can't be closed. It's not like a novel that has a start and a finish, but it is kind of like a novel, a story, in that we need to read it chronologically to really fully understand it. But yeah, there may be some shared concerns that we would say we'll lump them together in this case in philosophy of history, the sharing of addressing a certain group of questions, quandaries, concerns, inquiries. But again, when do we know that there's enough shared? When do we know that they're relevant enough and there are no important relevant differences to be grouped together as such? And I think that maybe this is why so many end up rejecting labels. A lot of the pragmatists didn't want that label. One of the philosophers that I explore, Ferdinand Schiller, British philosopher, he called his philosophy humanism. Peirce called his pragmaticism, this really ugly term for it. So you often find this, right? And maybe it has to do with that, because they don't want to be lumped together in this category, thinking that there aren't enough shared concerns, there aren't enough similarities. And I think even when we just look at philosophy itself broadly, it's probably the most debated academic discipline as to what it even is about, right? So yeah, is this the same with other categories, philosophy of history possibly being a misnomer, like with metaphysics, or categories in history, or categories in the history of philosophy, like the medieval period or the modern period, right? And going back to the question of philosophy, I actually have this image I want to show you. It's just really funny. I can share the screen, right?
I believe so, but I can potentially fiddle with settings if you have any trouble.
Yeah, I see it. So I just love this meme here because I just think it's so true. So if we can't even necessarily agree on defining philosophy, right? So philosophy of history being all lumped together. So that was a really long first question. Anybody have any thoughts about that? All of that?
I can say something by way of weighing in. First of all, I do want to appreciate, I have no idea whether and to what extent this is a meme, but it's a meme now. It's a meme now that it's been shared. If it wasn't before. So yeah, one thing that I would say about philosophy generally, and this is something I've been thinking about recently, it's been on my mind in an unproductive way because I have other projects to be doing, but it seems like philosophy is basically the science of concepts, right? And when we're working with concepts, we're trying to figure out whether they're coherent, whether they amongst each other, whether they make sense of experiences, how they make sense of experiences, so on and so forth. We're just working with the broad category of concepts, which is such a broad category because the only other thing in experience is like the raw data of experience, which needs to be conceptualized, about to be made sense of. So like it's everything, it's everywhere all at once. And the frustrating part about that is that we then have to just take philosophy as such and like divide it up into separate academic disciplines as a matter of, well, first of all, sometimes just as a strictly historical artifact, but also just by way of securing some kind of economic convenience to it, right? Like you can only spend so much time studying something before you have to graduate college or whatever. And so you wind up having to compartmentalize just as a result of limited time and resources with which to study and to teach. So like whether or not you can have a philosophy of anything, I feel like is still going to be an open question. But if it's settled one way or the other, I think it's going to turn on whether or not it's helpful to do these compartmentalizations rather than whether or not these compartmentalizations represent something real. I take it to be reasonably conclusive that they don't. So yeah, if anyone wants to jump on that.
That's great.
Sort of share. So like also echoing it, I don't know that I would call this a meme so much as just like a historically accurate depiction of reality.
We are sharing it.
Yeah,
It's a
thank you.
meme.
Right.
But like I will tell a little story. There's a class that William and I have both taken that's called Philosophy and Feminism, and William and I have done little micro debates back and forth about whether or not the article "and" was the most important one or the most accurate one, or whether or not it should be "of." And I'm still generally of the opinion that like I don't know, like that they mean different things. So like like history of philosophy or a theory of history or whatever, like it different paths to the same end, I guess, different names for the same fundamental idea. That's just sort of my 2 cents, I guess.
I mean, I could just jump in real quick, and it's just because I feel like philosophy is it's like it's like it started out kind of as the original science. You know, if you were doing natural sciences or you were doing natural philosophy, and then it branched off, and the sciences kind of like became their own thing. But they were still very much intertwined with philosophy, in that there's a philosophy of science and there's a philosophy of biology and all the other things, and it's just like, but it kind of started off as just like, what, it's just us asking questions like, what are we doing, what is, like, just asking things around us, and then it just kind of devolved into this just giant conglomerate mess of subjects, I would say. So it did that because, like, I feel like as we developed as throughout history, we are more able to ask more questions. We have more time to ask more questions and more time to ask what we're doing. And I feel like that's kind of like, because like without we wouldn't be doing philosophy if we're all huddled around a fire trying to find our next food source. So like I just feel like as we've evolved, the curiosity within our genetic DNA or something has just kind of allowed us to flourish in this philosophical sense.
Diana, everyone said something besides you. Do you want to jump in?
That's totally fine. I will say I think one last thing. One thing that I think is very interesting, and it's just my historical reading of philosophy as a discipline and how it's sort of branched off. I think like 2 things have historically happened in addition to the economic and institutional contexts. One is that philosophy kind of branches out when things are found out and pieced together. So we figure something out about animals and plants and whatnot. This kind of diverges and branches into biology. We figure something out about shapes and math. This branches out into geometry. But there's also I take it, a long tradition of introducing philosophy, or roughly the science of concepts, to existing fields that were built previously just out of practical wisdom, right? So we have agriculture, and then we develop that into more of a science by folding in ideas that are philosophic in nature, but also more specifically biological. We have governance and lawmaking is a lot older than philosophy as a field. So we derive something like political science or ethics from introducing philosophical concepts and mixing them in with like the practical understanding that comes from long histories of governing and being governed. So that's kind of interesting. So I think that informs the way it compartmentalizes. There's a lot of fields that are found to be like seemingly academically beneficial to segment off from philosophy as such, institutionally, and there are a lot of fields that sort of existed as discrete identifiable things in the inchoate universe that then philosophy gets introduced to, and those become academic disciplines as well. And that's, again, just my reading of it, but that it makes sense, and I think that's something worth bearing in mind when we talk about something like the philosophy of anything, because it's ultimately going to be a distinction made based on those sorts of contextual factors. So yeah.
Yeah, those are all great points. Yeah, I think as you said in your first comment, William, at some point, right, we have to kind of put some sort of an understanding around something, right? Or in this case, a kind of category designation. But that's also us recognizing that we don't really fully understand it, right? It's kind of like this book itself, I feel like, it's incomplete, but at some point, right? Or when you're writing a paper, right? At some point, you just have to like stop. And so, yeah, but I think that in the case of like Ortega raising this concern, it's more so for trying to like humble the exploration more by saying, look, we can have a theory on it, but not a philosophy of it, right? Because a theory, right, is a kind of web of concepts, right? A system of ideas, as opposed to a philosophy of, right, which is more grounded. So yeah, in the case of a pragmatist philosophy of history, which is compartmentalizing it even more, right? Which, as you mentioned early on, also, it's not a branch it's a branch that's growing, a sub-branch within the philosophy of history. You won't find it yet in anthologies on philosophy of history, but I really think that soon we'll see that. We'll see at least a little section there on it, because I am definitely not the only one researching this and writing about it. But in that case, they also, I would say, in my judgment, are consistent in also seeing it as a complement, and it's a method. It's not the only way to approach the study of history. Definitely not. It's just a complement to other ways, because it can't be enough, right, to fully understand it. So it's just one way of approaching history, but we should, of course, also use other approaches. Yeah, so the next question I had is, how is history present? So in other words, how is history present in the present? What makes us historical beings? How conscious are we of our historicity? Is it with us all the time? Like, how often do we think about the past? How often do we essentially live in the past? Because for pragmatists, history is not ever disconnected, right? It's similar, and they all share this as a kind of like William James, his philosophy on this stream of consciousness. It's the same kind of idea, but the stream of history. So it's never disconnected from the present and the future. So what do you all think about that?
It's slightly a footnote, but immediately my impression is that, like, asking this question at all instantiates for me how our divisions of labor and academia are potentially very helpful, but ultimately artificial, because you can't after a fashion separate the various philosophies and sciences and practical wisdoms from one another. Immediately when you ask, like, how is history present, in what way is it present, I'm going all the way to metaphysics in my head, like trying to sketch out that framework and start there, because it's ultimately that we're drawing from the same well, which is just a messy universe, right? So yeah, in what sense is history present? I don't know. There's roughly metaphysical answers that we could start to sketch, but like in what sense is it, like, present for us subjectively at the moment? That's That's interesting. I don't know. Do we live in the past? Do we live for the future? Is there any meaningful difference we draw between those things? I mean, certainly people have a sense about tradition that suggests a very close relation to how we think about the past and the future. But not everyone has that same conceit. So strictly subjectively, I don't know.
There's a quote that's been said by an assortment of different people that creativity is the art of hiding your influences. And in terms of like, are we living in the past? Are we, living in the future, or whatever? Where are we in history? Like, we are the current, without getting into the metaphysics of time, iteration of a long string of people who have hidden their influences. We are sort of the byproduct of the history that came before us, and are the history that will be talked about later. Not to be too vain or anything, but like it's all just in the progress, regress, forward march of humanity, I guess. I don't know. That sounded pretentious.
The causal cascade and the social project. That is the human experiments.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Like we are the byproduct of history, just as we are the producer of the future, right? So we come about, so we're connected both always to us in every sense. Like we are always the product of the past, but also the producer of the future. So it's like the present is just this kind of ever moving shift of what is past and what is future.
I remember last time we had you on, Dr. Binder, we at some point were talking about the notion, arguably the myth, that history tends to repeat itself. Like there's a cyclical nature to history, or a repetitious nature to it, and that kind of that idea, I think, comes about as kind of a way of answering this question: how are we connected to history? In what sense is history present? It's present as like a force that's guiding us on that model. It seems like there's it's simultaneously causes us, and it's being made by us, but it's ultimately like a thing in and of itself, in that on the model in which there's a cyclical nature to it, and that's I don't know. I think we came down on the side of that's not a very helpful way to think about it. Ultimately, if there's a cyclical nature to history, it's contingent, not natural. But that way of trying to understand it bears out, I suppose, how people are in practice thinking about history, because they wind up conceiving of it as having this necessary force about it, rather than a contingent and influenceable one. On the other hand, you have, like, I don't know, libertarians in the philosophic sense, where we can, at least in some way, disconnect from history, in that we can make truly free decisions that aren't themselves reducible to impact from the past, or that aren't simply the end of a causal chain. There's something else there. So that would be a way in which we're less connected with history, if that were borne out.
And then you have political libertarians who also kind of think you can divorce yourself from various things, but that's neither here nor there.
By never changing anything.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting, because when we approach history as cyclical, you can, in one sense, that can be not very helpful, because then it seems like we're just kind of on this like cosmic merry-go-round or something. But at the same time, if we see it as a sort of circles that are moving like this, I mean, perhaps that's one way to envision it, that there's maybe kinds of patterns and trends that we can extract to try to learn something that can apply to the future, to understand our present, but also how we can apply these lessons for the future. Because if we can't take something like that, then what we lose a lot of the value of studying history, right? So So perhaps we can see it like that, because yeah, it doesn't repeat itself exactly, but maybe there are certain kinds of patterns and trends that we can extract those to better predict the future. So awesome. Yeah. So the next question, what does history teach us? What does it consist of? How do we know, represent, and explain history? What is historical knowledge? Pragmatists will say that if I had to really summarize it very, very briefly, it tells us that it teaches us about problem solving. History teaches us what is meaningful to us, what is useful, what is interesting, what is functional, what is instrumental, what is relevant and significant. It can tell us what cannot be. Right? This is something that it can definitely tell us. It can tell us about what makes a practical difference in our life. Can it go beyond this? Well, pragmatism would say we can't be sure. We can't be sure if we can go beyond it teaching us what is at least meaningful, useful, practical, functional, etc. for us, like some kind of more transcendental truth about things. That's not to negate that it isn't possible, right? But it's just that we can't be sure, right? This is just kind of typical pragmatist creed in general in epistemology. So we could say it's our believed understanding. History is what we experience it to be. And in order to maintain its record as a kind of, as Dewey would call it, warranted assertion about what happened in the past and what kind of narrative we've drawn about it to get some meaning, is that it needs to be continually tested and verified in order to maintain that status, right? But of course, something could come along that would change that, and we would need to rewrite history. And we rewrite history a lot, right? And I think that's part of what they're getting at, right? Time doesn't stop, history doesn't stop. Our contemplation of it, our understanding of it is not going to stop either. I mean, we're constantly rewriting history, with over hundreds of years, new studies on the ancient period, right? And so that makes us question, or assume, I think, that we probably will never stop rewriting history. And that's just very much true to pragmatist creed and their methodology. So one thing is certain, that we can learn from history, but again, what do you think it teaches us exactly?
One thing I want to ask, kind of as a presage, is you point out this notion of the lack of transcendental nature to pragmatist theoretic frameworks, right? So we're just trying to figure out what's meaningful and what will make a difference to us in a practical way. And it can't or it doesn't go beyond that. But what I want to try to cash out would be, do you think it's a feature of the theory or of the a pragmatist framework, irrespective of whether or not it's a theory, that it doesn't go beyond the practical, or is it sort of a limitation to which you would have to affix some other theoretic framework to make up for the lack of transcendentality? I don't know, to pragmatism. Basically, yeah. What is pragmatism sufficient on your view, or can it be sufficient, or do you need further theoretic scaffolding to be built?
I think you definitely need further theoretic scaffolding, as you said, and I think that they, especially in the case of studying history, would agree with that and see this as, again, a sort of complement, but not a full, complete method. It's not the only way, and it shouldn't be the only way to approach history. But I think one thing I just want to mention that I think is often a misconception about pragmatism is that it's just, there's nothing beyond the practical, the useful, but that's not necessarily denied. It's just a denial of or a recognition of the difficulty of being so certain about objective truths, let's say, or objective historical meanings. and instead to focus on something that is much easier to comprehend, which is how it was useful, how it was meaningful to us, right? I mean, that we can very directly approach, right? I think that, for example, history books, other than telling us about that period and the content itself, it tells us a lot about the time in which it was published. In other words, why was that topic explored then? And so it's this sort of like meta historical analysis that we can extract from there of, that topic, that inquiry was interesting then. And so it actually says a lot about the time rather than the contents. It's, not just the contents, but the time that it was published and why it was explored in that time. Because as I mentioned before, from a pragmatist perspective, it's not just the historians that find a topic of interest, it's also dependent upon the audience and the continued circulation because of interest, right? Otherwise, it will just collect dust right on the shelves. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers all of your question.
Oh, it's good. Fittingly, it seems like there's a very practically useful humility endemic to classical pragmatism as we're laying it out.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that is helpful clarification for me, and I hope for somebody else. I don't know.
Yeah, great. So then the final question I have, how should we study history? What is the goal? It's ideally, of course, not just about understanding what happened, but also understanding how it's still with us today, how it explains the present, and even more ideally, how it can help us make better predictions about the future. We are naturally problem solvers, and I think we like that so much that even when we don't have problems, we may often create them so we have a problem to solve. I mean, this is part of the human condition, right? So I think, pragmatism we can summarize as a philosophy that inquires into this, right? Into solving problems. And so we should approach history also as, a series of problems that we needed to solve. And sometimes we don't solve them, right? Sometimes they come up again. Or sometimes, a new solution comes present. But I think that we can see this, for example, very much in the history of philosophy. Sorry to keep quoting from Ortega, but he has this really elaborate theory on history, as well as on the history of philosophy. And he describes the history of philosophy as a series of errors, right? It's just like we're constantly trying to figure something out. We're constantly trying to solve a problem, but we never actually really solve things because it's just, we get little nuggets of insight from the series of errors, but it just keeps going. So yeah, that was my last question.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to do with an analogy. Like let's say you come across someone, you're like, oh, like you found like $1 left on the ground, and then no, it turns out someone's got it on like a fishing line or something. When you reach down to pull it up, and they're gonna pull it away from you and make you look like a fool. And then you go and you see someone else about to do that same thing, and you say, no, man, no, don't do that. There's some asshole pulling pregnant on there or whatever. You're trying to take your experience to help shape someone else. History is just that on a macro level. That's yeah. I don't really have any further elaboration than that. It's the same thing. It is the basic person to person trying to help one another through stuff, just on a macro, bigger level.
Yeah, solving problems. Yeah.
I do love the characterization of philosophy as the litany of errors, because yeah, everyone's wrong about everything. Sorry, I interrupted.
Sorry. I see, history, because it's like a series of questions that we ask that culminates in so for stuff like what happened, like how exactly did it happen, right? And then you lead up to the kind of like this culminating question of like, what was the underlying cause that caused it to happen? Like, if you're looking at a war, what built up to the war happening? Why did the war happening? And it's really just like looking at at a series of motivations throughout history to then look at like actions being motivated by reasons, I guess, is how I look at it. Is like the culminating question is like the first thing we always ask in history is like, what happened? Okay. And can we prove that it happened? And then it goes down. And then like, once we know that things like exactly how things happened, then we look at like why they happened. So I feel like that's really the culmination of history, is looking at the underlying causes of why certain things happen.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I can build on that slightly. The thing I want to be cautious about, and I'm sure that we will be, but because I trust people in this room, but like I want to attend to it a little bit, is that different readings of history, because they have this nature of trying to explain why and trying to convince people of things and having normative implications, that makes them useful for different ends, and actors who have those ends as their priorities are differently powerful in various social contexts. So one thing we want to be like looking at with special scrutiny is how what the various readings of history do imply normatively. So if we I don't know, the easy examples are all like the fascist readings of history, with the cult of tradition, with the normative implication that we need to get back to that by suppressing people more than we already do. Obviously, that's a way of doing history and a reading of history that's intellectually empty, but it still is persuasive to enough people that it sometimes works, and that's an issue. Other times you have readings of history which are still tailored towards specific ends, and those specific ends are not necessarily beneficent ones, but are intellectually sophisticated enough to hide that well and be and speak to something that is true and be insufficient rather than straight up wrong. And that's also something that we want to be careful about as we're going about establishing pragmatic readings of history, or pragmatic philosophies about history. Because the different readings that compete with one another will have different practical uses to different and differently powerful agents in society. Again, I trust people in this room to like be attentive to that. To not read history in a way that's going to be destructive. But it can happen accidentally too. So that's something that we want to bear in mind, not just here, but like going forward always.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the objections that I do address, because that is something that can happen, right? It can be used for nefarious purposes, but that doesn't, of course, mean that that will always be the case, and we can, be on the lookout for it. But I do cite examples when that precisely does happen, because that is a concern, and also why I want to use it as a complement, as a method, right? But not as like the only way of approaching. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
So
that's the discussion question.
I mean, not for nothing though, but like noting instances in history when history was being abused and used to justify fascism is sort of, I don't know, that sort of seems like kind of the point of history after a fashion is, using history to point out bullshit uses of history.
Or communism. Both authoritarian regimes use revisionist history. So pretty much just any authoritarianism.
Oh yeah, any authoritarianism, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. This has happened throughout
the
history.
tirade of how communism is mischaracterized because of specifically the authoritarian regimes that have said they're communist without actually being communist. Okay, cool. That is, as I understand it, the last discussion question, right? So like, we're about to get to the sort of meat of the talk. But we have, does anybody especially who hasn't spoken yet, want to share some initial conceptualizations with us? Okay. In that case, I'll say, like, feel free to proceed. I just want to make sure we give, I guess, some time for folks who haven't talked yet.
Yeah, of course. And while I'm reading a little bit from it, then of course, if you have any comments, questions, just let me know and I'll pause. So yeah, I'll I wanted to share the table of contents here. Let's see. Oh, wait, why can't I get to? Well, this is the cover. That's not what I wanted. It's the other tab. I can't open it.
I was going to say, if the table of contents is in another window, the way Zoom does it, it's possible it's only showing that one window.
Okay. Yeah, I think I got it.
As opposed to the screen proper. I don't know.
Yeah.
Zoom is fun.
Yeah, I'm ashamed that I'm not more skilled with this, given everything that we've been through. So yeah, so these are the chapters that I ended up working with. I had one draft that I just completely scrapped and changed half the book. So first, yeah, this first book goes into the classical pragmatists, and I'm exploring William James, John Dewey, Ferdinand Canning Scott Schiller, Charles Peirce, George Meade, and Jane Addams. And so I tried to focus each chapter on how they each had a contribution that gives us a fuller picture of what a pragmatist philosophy of history looks like. And then the last chapter really, I think, wraps it together, because Jane Addams really put this into practice as like a really true pragmatist. She put this all into practice, and it had really important ethical implications I think are really interesting. I'm not sure how much I'll be able to say, of course, about each one of these. I think each one of these chapters I can talk so much about. So that's why I just want to kind of read mostly from a little bit from the introduction to just outline what this all looks like together. And of course, don't really have time to go into like the meat of this, but yeah, so on the topic of history, the classical pragmatists did not actually write a great deal, but I argue here that there is adequate material to present the case for a pragmatist philosophy of history. But we must begin by recognizing the need for flexibility on this topic, because true to pragmatist creed, our philosophical discussion on history is ever evolving. Just as pragmatism is a living philosophy that does not seek an absolute end to inquiry, so too must be a pragmatist philosophy on history. The human mind and the way it navigates inquiry is located in historically embedded practices. As new demands arise, these practices change over time, forcing us to adapt. Pragmatism as a living, evolving, dynamic, open philosophical approach is a very effective method to help us better understand that process. That there is no essence to pragmatism is a doctrine shared by all the thinkers classified within this tradition, which translates into a varied set of philosophers with very significant differences. But we cannot escape our historicity, and thus the pragmatists each had individual backgrounds that played a role in influencing some very different ideas about what pragmatism aimed to provide for the philosophical landscape. But it should be noted that this is not necessarily entrapping, and there are, of course, other important contextual factors. Certainly, however, they shared an interest in examining some vital human tensions, especially how practices and habits develop over time, and the process of inquiry in the interim. The classical pragmatists shared the aim to study what guides our selective memory, our present attention, and how this is all maintained via confirmation in the future. Each of the classical pragmatists explored here offers, again, a piece to a fuller picture for better processing the past, as well as how it impacts our present and our future. So again, I focus only on the classical pragmatists. In the first chapter, I focus on the individual psychological element of the continuous stream of pragmatic memory as elaborated on by William James. The second chapter, I talk about the communal landscape and explore John Dewey's view on the societal and educational elements that influence pragmatic inquiry and action. And in the third, I examine the general process of pragmatic reevaluation by the individual within society as found in Ferdinand Canning Scott Schiller's philosophy. In the fourth one, try to outline the rigorous standards that are proposed by Charles Peirce for a kind of scientific community of inquirers that can be applied to a pragmatist analysis of historical data. And I think this one, I want to say Peirce is interesting because one thing I really appreciated about putting this together is that I feel like this is a unique way that we can kind of combine a more speculative with a more analytic approach. I mean, pretty much all of them except for Peirce, I would put more in the speculative category, but Peirce brings in that analytic approach that just really gives us an even fuller picture of what a pragmatist philosophy of history looks like. And then in the fifth chapter, investigate this process and how it's all communicated by individuals within a society per the social psychological assessment of need. And then in the sixth chapter, look at the ethical relevance of this fuller picture as exemplified in the work of Jane Addams. And then in the conclusion, I try to address all of at least the key objections that are raised against both pragmatism generally and a pragmatist philosophy of history. But I want to start with this quote of William James. His general concept of pragmatism is very nicely summarized in this quote. He says, "What difference would it practically make to anyone if this notion rather than that notion were true? If no practical difference whatever can be traced, then the alternatives mean practically the same thing, and all dispute is idle. Whenever a dispute is serious, we ought to be able to show some practical difference that must follow from one side or the other's being right." So a pragmatist philosopher of history, because again, they didn't write a whole lot explicitly on history, so I'm taking this and trying to apply it to history. So I'd say a pragmatist philosopher of history then would ask what practical difference it makes for this or that historical fact to be taken as true. The pragmatist concept of true is that something is useful, significant, interesting, and meaningful, or at least this is as much as we can know. From this Jamesian position, the next step is to then consider that the principal motivation behind what is recorded, what continues to circulate, and to what extent in the annals of historical texts. The pragmatist philosophy of history substitutes pragmatic truth for historical truth, which by this is meant historical assertion, because there's no end of inquiry with a pragmatic lens. Part of the methodology of pragmatism is derived from history, since usefulness, significance, and meaningfulness are attested over time. Additionally, history and historiography are shaped in part by pragmatic interests. Pragmatism is best understood as a method, and as such, it can be applied to better understanding how we conceptualize, remember, and record history. As a method, it can be applied to studying how we understand history, how we conduct historiography, and aid in understanding which histories are written and why. Historical recordings are the result of being working, functional, and thus we may equate useful and good with true, but this does not guarantee that recorded histories are actually true from a pragmatist position. Despite this and many other limitations of historical study in general, the goal in presenting a pragmatist philosophy of history is to add another apparatus to the toolkits of the philosopher and the historian. A pragmatist perspective for history and historiography is therefore, again, meant to complement other methodology. History is a complicated notion because history itself and historical writing are indeed two different concepts. Broadly and plainly defined, history is the events of the past. It is past time. Historiography refers to the interpretations we then create of those events of the past, of the time that has passed. So this is the written result of historical record. So in other words, historiography is about how history is studied and recorded. The past is full of historical facts, details, events, people. And the next step is for historians to both describe them and try to make sense out of that data, or some sense. Otherwise, the nondescript definition of history as time past would be meaningless, right? But how can the historian be certain that the descriptions truly match the past events selected for recording? Regarding accuracy, how close in time should the historian be to the event being recorded? Some have argued that the further away in time, the less accurate the recording. However, sometimes temporal distance can increase impartiality. though this is not a guarantee of objectivity. There are many important quandaries such as these in philosophizing about the past. Nonetheless, the main claim to highlight here is that few would disagree that complete objectivity in historical reporting seems to be impossible. But more importantly, what a pragmatist philosophy of history aims for is to avoid the overly simplistic definition of history as the study of the past, and instead to provide a pragmatic answer to what history is sometimes understood in part to be, and what it is sometimes in part for, because it is pragmatic and because it is meant to serve as a complementary methodology. So certainly a history book written today about ancient Greece would be quite different from one written in the Middle Ages for many reasons. A historian is always writing with his or her present day lens. We must try to consider the text in and of itself while trying to see through the same lens. And indeed, though not a novel claim, a historical text is also revealing about the time it is being written in, along with the contents in and of themselves. For a historical text to be interesting, useful, and meaningful, as well as for it to circulate broadly and continue to circulate, it must have utility among the writers and readers. There must be a convergence of pragmatic values in the form of needs, urges, and practical motivations. Lack of such pragmatic motivation results in the book collecting dust, or in some cases, eventually going out of print and disappearing altogether. So historical recording that is practically motivated, as opposed to that scrutinized for its own sake, will necessarily be selective about the data included. But, and I think this is a very important point, this angling, this necessarily selected data need not lead to a falsehood. A historian that sets out, as often happens with a topic to investigate, need not necessarily end up reaching false conclusions. A historian that examines data without an aim will not necessarily result in objective and true conclusions. Certain historical occurrences are simply unnecessary to record because they are irrelevant. What is recorded is what the historian or historians believe is practically useful to record. What the historian assumes the readers will also consider useful to record, and what the larger public indeed does believe, in fact, is useful to record. So, yeah, I mean, if we were to peruse the top-selling history books, in the case of considering the general audience, we should also consider what I would call intra-history, what it is about today that makes those books interesting for the historian to research and write, as well as to the larger public. Part of the reason for this may relate to the writing style of the historian, him or herself, but as emphasized throughout this book, it can also tell us about our own time. As noted, some may argue that history can only be known long after whenever the historical detail in question passed. Of course, what long means can be debated, while others might argue that it's best studied closer in time. So a pragmatist interpretation of history and historiography can address and incorporate both positions. I think this is a unique contribution that it makes. There is, of course, more than one way to talk about the past, and there is no one right way to talk about the past. So again, this is a complement. For some, it is argued that the study of history is deemed inadequate when it comes to epistemic value, while others argue the opposite. But either way, despite the generally agreed upon limitations of what knowledge exactly can be provided from historical study, and despite the critiques of pragmatism, part of the argument presented here is that valuable insight is gained from taking a pragmatist perspective nonetheless. There is much value in better understanding why certain historical details have relevance, significance, meaningfulness, and interest for us. As human beings, this project helps us better understand ourselves and our human recorded history. Often what is remembered and recorded in a broad sense, both as individuals and as communities, is what makes a practical difference in our lives, because that then ideally not only helps us better approach and solve current problems, but also those in the future. It still matters what is useful and meaningful for us to consider as historical fact, even if we cannot be certain when it may overlap with an objective historical reality. And I think also that there is a hierarchy of utility at any moment in time of historical texts. From a pragmatist perspective, the past is never really gone and done with. We talked about this before, right? It's on a continuum. It is ongoing. It helps us understand the present and the future. There is no end of inquiry to history and historiography. As again, to use Dewey's term, what is yielded in historical research are warranted assertions. Historical facts are attested over time. The more they are affirmed by more historians and their readership over more stretches of time, the more accepted and prevalent those historical assertions become. But with the pragmatist lens, we must always remain open to the fallibilistic creed that new evidence may arise that will rewrite histories. So pragmatic motivations for studying and recording history vary, of course, in different time periods. So as an example, Edward Gibbon's book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, it reflects a lot, not only the history of the Roman period, but the then present day interests in the late 18th century to argue against the growing religious fervor in his nation of England and in support of a more secular approach, because he saw, pointed to religion as being a major source of this fall. And so he was also using it to promote what he wanted to promote in his own time period, right? So I think also a pragmatist philosophy of history is in a unique position, as I mentioned before, to bridge the speculative analytic divide. James's view provides psychological insight into how individuals attribute meaning, search for patterns, and generally try to make sense of the past. So this is a focus in the speculative view in the philosophy of history that contemplates the content of history. So the speculative view, looks at past events and circumstances with the goal to make sense of history, as opposed to the analytic view that looks at questions like what constitutes good historical facts, good historical explanation. So it's not really about meaning, rather it's about logical analysis, the empirical investigation into history, and Peirce adds in that perspective. The rest are very much speculative, but I think because we can combine some of both, then it gives us this fuller picture, and that's really valuable about pragmatism. Dewey augments this by adding in the communal element, which Schiller bridges with his analysis of this as a process as an individual within the society. I put hyphens there that, we're always individual within a society in his view. Peirce, in his more analytic approach, provides rich content for the rigorous standards that historians should follow to make the discipline more logically and scientifically based, in his focus on critically analyzing how historians carry out their work. So this analytic position approaches history as a subject. And then Mead, he continues to add to the more speculative position by adding this social psychological discussion of how this is all communicated pragmatically. And then finally, Adams brings this all to a conclusion by putting all of this into practice. So I also explore the objections, principle one being the possibility for kind of infinite pluralization with this methodology. There's, of course, the problem of being wary of falling into the trappings of relativism and too much emphasis on the subjective. But it's interesting because Schiller provides an interesting response to that, arguing that a position of impartiality runs the risk of leading to indifference. And, we hope to get something out of history, right? Not to mention that history is simply not as interesting or useful, generally speaking, when presented as like a strict chronology, right? It's more interesting and useful when some kind of cohesive and coherent narrative is created out of those historical details, right? A study of history for its own sake, as to one that's practically motivated, it might imply impartiality, but this doesn't guarantee it, right? Mistakes can be made still, whether consciously or not. And a narrative history, even if it's angled, does not mean it will necessarily be false. So again, there is the objection that a pragmatist philosophy of history does not provide a full picture of how to study history, but this is why I insist throughout that it's meant to be a complement to additional ways of approaching the study of history and historiography. Now, in this project, there are terms that really need to be clearly defined, and this is something I recognize that's hard to do and kind of missing from here. For example, having a more clear definition of what it means for something to be historically significant versus, say, historically useful. Because certainly there are significant moments in history that are not useful, or useful moments in history that are not significant. But a pragmatist philosophy on human history can help us with the latter notion. As again, it's probably easier to determine what is useful and meaningful for us versus what is significant and important in history. And there's still great value in that, in my argument. I mean, we are nothing without our histories. We are historical beings. Everything, at least in part, is a historical process. We're all connected in a continuum of incessant time, so we cannot fully understand anything outside of its historical context. And I really think an effective way to philosophize about this is with a pragmatist lens. We cannot stop time. Again, the present becomes the past almost quickly as we say it. We're always embedded in a historical moment, in a paradigm of historical knowledge and existence. So we must ask, what has pragmatic motivation to be selected for evidence, record, interpretation, and readership? So the last thing I want to address, since, yeah, I mean, there's so much I want to say, but some more about some of the key objections here. Again, the critique with the position of relativism is an important one, but I do think there are some ways for us to overcome being trapped in this. There is indeed an important critique on so much emphasis on the subjective, but I think that Schiller's emphasis on the need to avoid indifference in historical study provides a good reason why there's still value in that. Another critique, as William brought up, is regarding the idea that too much, say, confirmation bias and too much emphasis on this cash value can play into a pragmatist philosophy of history. But I do think that ultimately this is a common misreading when pragmatism is understood as only being about this kind of like cash value approach. It's really not just about, it's not an anything goes philosophy, right? I mean, especially when you look at Peirce and his very rigorous standards he wants us to follow to get the most reliable kind of inferences about the past. You know, it's not anything goes. Inquiries and their tested solutions arise in a historical context. Thus, a future study, I think, on looking next at the neo and contemporary pragmatists will really demonstrate this also all at work, and offer fresh insight into more applications of this philosophy for history. History needs philosophy to critically analyze the processing and possible meanings of historical data. The history of philosophy teaches us that some controversies remain unresolved. And I think pragmatism reminds us of the need for humility in this pursuit of wisdom. There is this quote has been attributed to many, but this idea that you know, history is philosophy teaching by example, right? And from a pragmatist perspective, I would say one that, you know, doesn't end. So that's all I wanted to read from my introduction. So I'll turn it over if anyone has anything, any thoughts or questions or anything so far.
Wonder, and I absolutely feel that, but like, oh God, there's so much I want to say. What do I pick? Which in the triage of the millions of things. The one thing I'll ask, like, sort of initially is, did you find it restrictive or more, I don't know, satisfying maybe to write in terms of, or to structure the book in terms of these specific thinkers, or in terms of thinkers in general, as opposed to exploring topics or subtopics of the book in a more general fashion, where you connect lots of different thinkers in a sort of in the sort of unstructured way. Like I don't know, I might do that approach. Is it better to, or did you find it better to be focusing on these individuals' work for each specific subject area, or was it more, I don't know, was there a different reason besides that just being the best way to write this book?
Yeah, I have no idea what would be, the best way. This is, I wanted to, I mentioned that I kind of like scrapped half of it in the first draft, and I added in these 3 new thinkers, because the original draft I had a whole chapter that was dedicated to applications of this, like looking at historical examples with all of this lens. And I just felt like it was kind of too much. And so this, I want to like lay down the framework, a more fuller framework, and then this can be then applied to any other kind of historical example. And I thought that they really each bring in something, a unique contribution, right? Like, as I mentioned, William James is very focused on the individual, John Dewey on the social situation, on the role of education in this. Schiller talks a lot about values and how that arises through history. Peirce, of course, is calling for the scientific community of inquirers, and lays down some very rigorous standards for how to avoid fallacies that are unique to thinking about the past. And so he really provides a lot of really good standards and a more structured way of applying this. And then Mead, who's a social psychologist, but he's very much a pragmatist, and he looks at how then we communicate pragmatically, and so it sheds some insight into this question of how something arises to be historically useful or historically significant. And then Adams, as I mentioned, who she's been perhaps not appreciated as much because her writing style is very very unacademic, it's not very coherent, but she really, more than anything, tries to transcribe what it was like putting all this into practice, and it has these really important implications for what we could call a pragmatist ethics. Which,
So
by the way, sorry.
Well, I'm just wanting to maybe add on to it. Like, it sounds like it was sort of maybe, and this is just methodologies for writing a book. Like, it sounds like it was a kind of a liberating constraint in some ways to be focusing on various individuals and their various works, just because that meant you didn't, as the person writing the chapter, you don't, the list of topics to address is a little bit more easy to set, and you know, to if it's something you kind of that might relate, but that can't be cleanly folded into the chapter, maybe it's something you don't have to fold in at all because that thinker didn't discuss it, so on and so forth. Like this way of going about writing the book it seems like it's practically, or it can be practically beneficial. And it's again meta commentary, but I have a concern with philosophy in general that it focuses too much on thinkers and what they thought over and above, what, for lack of a more clean way of saying it, what the truth is of the matter. It's really hard to do both, as I've found within constraints. So it's, but it seems, I obviously read this book, it's not even published yet, but it seems like it's trying to strike a good balance between those two general concerns.
Yeah, thanks. It's just like true to Pragmatist Creed, it feels unfinished. I think most people would say something like that, right? So there's certainly things missing 100%. But I think at least it gives us a bit of insight into what a pragmatist philosophy of history would look like through these particular thinkers. And since of course, like history is so central in this, and there's a kind of spirit of the times, and the lives of all of these thinkers overlapped. Most of them knew each other. Then it's sort of we're bringing in the historicity as well of why they're all kind of adding to this dialogue around the same time, which is interesting. And I wanted to mention too about Jane Addams, by the way. She is the first woman from the United States to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think she's just so amazing. It's like in very few anthologies on pragmatism do you find much about her, and so it's just I think that's what I really enjoyed the most, is learning more about her and trying to bring her more into the conversation, because she's just really got some very interesting insights.
Yeah, adding to history.
Right. Yeah. James, I talk about how in his focus on the individual, there's a kind of individual stream he talks about stream of consciousness, but I add in like historical consciousness, and then Dewey applies that to then how we work together as a community, and how, as I mentioned before, the problems that we need to solve and the goals that we create, they're personal and collective, right? Bias, this is kind of a loaded term, but say angling maybe is a better one, comes from the historians and the larger audience, right? So there's a kind of intersubjective communication going on here, which is what Mead really helps us better understand. Schiller, he talks about how truth has to be felt before it can be understood. So that's, I think, captures this notion that he then elaborates on. So James focuses on the individual, that part of this process, Dewey on society, and then Schiller on individual in society. It starts with the individual, it has to be felt before understood, he says, about history, or about truth, but we could say historical truth, right? And then Mead, in his elaboration on how we communicate this all, it's actually very similar to Schiller and to Peirce, but he talks about, before we can be a self, we have to be an other. The social self is necessary to be a self, because in our communication, the way we learn all of this is through the other. So he talks about like symbols and gestures, and the way, that we have to be. So he kind of, it's similar to Schiller, but he emphasizes more so the social self. And then again, Addams puts this all into practice. She actually created what was called the Whole House. She wanted to use memory to try and create solidarity, and in particular, she wanted to address the problems with the inclusion of immigrants in the United States, and really putting this all into practice to see how we could create a kind of social pragmatist morality. And I know I'm just like really skimming over some of this because there's so much to go into here, but those are some of the highlights of the different kind of contributions they have, but the way that they're also related and kind of piece together a fuller picture.
I have again so much more, but like I want to make sure I'm leaving space for everyone else to throw in their ideas. But I will chime in if I can.
I had to look up. I'm not super familiar with the whole pragmatism, so I had to look that up. Really, especially like pragmatic ethics, and it's very, I guess, worrying to me especially when you start applying pragmatism, because when you're talking about this like intra-history that you were saying, it's like different times find different things useful, which is what I guess is really what I guess makes it cool, that because like it's different. So that, but doesn't that mean like historical truth would then change from the same, like, so like it's just kind of like a hermeneutical problem, like where they're looking at the same stuff, but depending on the time they're looking at it, they're drawing different historical truths.
Yeah, well, you could say, I mean, history itself doesn't change, but our interpretations of it do. Yeah, but even if it weren't with a necessarily a pragmatic motivation, that could still be the case, right? Yeah, but that does also run the kinds of dangers that we were talking about.
Could we say more about the sort of specific standards of history which are proposed, but try to attenuate the problem of potentially having just infinite plurality or relativism about history, just by way of its being pragmatically aimed?
You mean the objection, or like the standards, for example, proposed by Peirce?
Yeah, the standards, the ways in which we prevent, or the ways we can prevent the mere play of differences from becoming sort of, I don't know, from dominating, like how the standards by which we might secure something more like the pragmatic definitive history, or the pragmatic truth of history, as opposed to having the infinite plurality that conceptually could arise from different people having different interests and attitudes.
Yeah, so essentially what Peirce does, there's a lot to say. Let's see if I can summarize it briefly. What he does is try to, in a sense, make historical study more scientific, we could say, because he points out the things that are uniquely problematic about history and historical inquiry as opposed to science, right? History is something that, especially when we go far back, as he points out, and elaborates on the problems with this, is something based on mostly testimony, right? And so the way it's approached then is very different than science, as we're just not working with the same kind of material, and there's obviously all sorts of problems with testimony. But he calls for us nonetheless to create a kind of scientific community of inquirers. So I'm going to open up my notes here on Peirce. So it's a very logical approach that he brings in. His main goal, as he defines it, is to free us from the tyranny of our preconceived notions. So this is where it gets very very sticky and hard to work with. But he gives us example of, for example, the preconceived notion that philosophers are eccentric, and there's this story of Thales walking and being so consumed by looking up at the sky, and he falls in a ditch, and people assume the story to be true because philosophers are eccentric, right? So they use this preconceived notion, and he wants us to, this is obviously can lead us down the wrong path for obvious reasons, but he really unpacks this through logic. So he says that so the ancient Greek preconceived notion that philosophers were eccentric served as a kind of antecedent to probability, as the way he describes it, for verifying a recorded account of Thales. So such related characteristics, stumbling and falling into a ditch while showing an old woman constellations, led people for many years to assert the veracity of that testimony as the antecedent probability based on the preconceived notion of an eccentric philosopher is not independent from the likelihood of that testimony, which is falling in the ditch must have been true because he was a philosopher and philosophers are eccentric. And to quote Peirce's words, he says, if it is not historical, it must surely have been its extreme antecedent likelihood which caused so many authorities to assert that it was true. Many more examples are needed in order to show how very far ancient testimony is from being independent of the antecedent probability of its matter. So he says the problem is, though, that testimony is not independent, right? Circumstantial evidence might be, but testimony isn't. So to try and avoid these problems, in some ways we can think of him not just asking for us to be more like scientists, but also kind of more like judges, because in some ways historians are acting more like lawyers trying to argue for a case rather than listening first to all of it, because these kinds of preconceived notions get in the way. And yeah, I mean, I think that's the most concise way I can summarize what he wants us to do to avoid those problems, is to, yeah, be more scientific, be more like judges, if that sort of makes sense.
I like the idea of any philosophical work, this one included, that aims to free us from preconceived notions. Like, it tends not, that's in the ballpark of emancipatory philosophy, and which is my sort of a special interest, I suppose. And yeah, counterintuitive. Something that I wanted to also ask is, so as we've gone through the structure of the book, obviously I know only the handful of details that you shared with us. But guessing from that, it seems like what we're sort of attending to in developing a pragmatic theory about history is confined seemingly to like the attitudes that people hold. So at the individual level, you have attitudes and preconceived notions. At the societal level, you have the way that those attitudes and preconceived notions interact with one another, and then you have the sort of individual within society navigating this relation. What I don't necessarily see here, and again, it might be attenuated to some other way, is the sort of politics and economics of how history is told, how it's written down, how it gets reinterpreted. Like when we talk about the insights from we can gain about a particular time and place by the historical texts, historical interpretations that were popular, that was said in terms of the audience and the author, but importantly, the publisher also operates, and the distribution network, and professors in schools and so forth. Each of whom, all of has a particular interest in something. So, like when legislators in Florida, I assume, would try to ban particular books because they promote so-called well, it is actually, but it's misattributed critical race theory. That would be an example of something that it sounds like the pragmatist theory of history isn't attending to at the moment, except in terms of like the attitudes of the politicians, which I would contend don't matter very much in the face of salient, like, structural forces acting on those politicians and how they're selected. So, like, is there more that I'm appreciating about social structure and political and economic forcing on history here, or is that something aside or something other?
Yeah, well, that's a great example, and I think that yes, that's obviously one direction it can take, but it can also take the other direction, right? It can take the direction of other kinds of questions that are interesting and lead us to do more research. Like over the last couple decades, we've learned a lot more, for example, about female philosophers. Well, that's interesting to us right now, right? So it can also go in the other direction and bring in more voices that have been silenced or hidden, right? So it can also go right the other way. And then, yeah, but that's true. There is, of course, that economic dimension as well, an important objection to pragmatism. But it's not, again, I want to emphasize, it's not just about like a cash value, right? Like William James and his very individual personal approach to that helps us see beyond it being just like, cash value, like when he talks about religion, right? And his varieties of religious experience, and he talks about how, it's not so important that it's, and especially we're talking about something faith-based, that it's true. If it helps you live a better life, that's most important, right? In his view.
Yeah, just to clarify, for at least from my understanding of things, there's also structural political and economic forcing involved in when histories when readings of history become better. So we're learning more about female philosophers. One thing that we want to fold into that is the fact that there are more female philosophers at the moment than there used to be. There are more women in positions of such power that they can mobilize the resources to do research on female philosophers and so forth. So like there's attitudes definitely involved and ways in which stuff is just subjectively interesting. I just don't. My thinking is that it doesn't reduce that far, that we should be able to fold in like I don't know. It's not even an objection. I just want to add to like this practical consideration that there's also the economics involved, as well as the individuals and the social attitudes and stuff. It's all interconnected, obviously, but that's something I want to attend to, because it can cause both very good readings of history and very bad ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and it's like we talked about in the last meeting, this idea of like history being written by the victors. That's usually the case, right? Because for a lot of those reasons that you just outlined. And so we want to, of course, try to avoid that and not just be complacent in it. But it's definitely something to at least keep in mind. But again, I don't think that it's necessarily always going to go down right a more nefarious path. It certainly does at times, but that's not like a guarantee by looking at things this way. Yeah.
As we say, there's always so much more, and this work continues, and I'm like super glad for that. I hope this being here at this meeting has served as kind of a way of platforming not only you and this project, but also the idea of it for people to keep in mind as they continue through their lives. Is there any because we've gone on for so long, and I take most of the responsibility for that. Are there any final thoughts from the participants before I give Dr. Binder sort of the concluding paragraphs? Okie dokie. Yeah. If Dr. Binder, if I've misread you and you are like this the finish to the presentation, feel free to correct me on that. But is there any sort of conclusion that you want to affix to this before we sign off?
No, just kind of what you said, that this is something that I think will start to appear more in the discussion on the philosophy of history. I feel pretty confident that it will. And of course, all of this remains unfinished, still exploring what this can mean. But this is the first book I've written, so it's certainly hard in like an hour and a half to find what I think are the most important things to summarize. But I, again, really appreciate getting this opportunity to talk about it and to share at least some of the basics of what the goal of a pragmatist philosophy of history looks like. And yeah, I hope at least, it's been different. It's a lot of these philosophers you will not find on most syllabi. Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, that this is the list of names I have literally never seen before as an undergraduate philosophy major. So yeah, thank you for that. And where can we? I think we mentioned that the book is out in January, but do you know where we will be able to find it?
Yeah, so it's with Roman and Littlefield, that's the publisher. And then there's a separate series they have with Lexington Books. It's this American philosophical series. And yeah, which I just want to add, this is the first fully North American movement in philosophy. And so I think it's really important that we include this more in the conversation. Yeah, there's a lot of visceral reaction, I know, from an analytic perspective to pragmatism. But I think to be a true philosopher, then we also need to address that, right? Address something that's very, very different. But yeah, it'll be out, I think, like mid-January. And yeah, thank you again for inviting me on here.
Oh yeah, thank you. And okay, unless there are any final comments I want to invite, then I'll go ahead and sign this off. All right. Yeah. Okay. So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks everyone who's watching for watching. This has been the meeting of Philosophy Club. I think it's the last one formally of the semester. But if you are seeing this later and you're in like the Discord and stuff, just keep that open, because if we want to get people together for something else, that will be the way we sort of administer it. That and Canvas. Okay. Thanks everyone, and I think that's it. I don't know. Buy this book. I think, right? It seems like it would be it's at least worth the read. And yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.